So this little note is to show um, a little tweak I made to a really cool program by Ramin Honary. Um, this program is called svg-analog-clock. Um, it's in his GitHub repository. Um, and what it does is it lets you draw a little analog clock, like the wall clocks you used to have in ancient days, um, that updates once a second with a beautiful, nice little red second hand. And I like this a lot. And I wanted actually to have sort of, because it's SVG, one, it only works in the GUI Emacs. So you can't do this with a character-only Emacs. But it means that you can sort of scale it, so you can have a little one, or you can have a very big one. And the thing that I liked about the big one is that I could use it sort of as I can see this clock from across the room, much like a wall clock used to be when I went to school. Um, but there's one slight drawback, and that slight drawback is visible here. You can see that when it updates the second hand, it's not quite aligned with the ticks. And that's because it draws the face and then it starts a 1 second timer, repeating timer, to update. And of course, there's no a priori need for that update to be aligned with when the instant that the second rolls over. So it's off by a little bit consistently. So I wanted to get a quick way and a reliable way to get it to be always aligned. And so I wrote this tiny little function. Now, SVG analog clock creates a mode which binds a key Q to let you basically kill the buffer. And here's my extra code. And it does a few things. The first thing is it sees if we have the buffer already. If we do, it skips all of the rest of the stuff in this particular clause. But if we don't, then it does find file no select to get that into the buffer. And then once it has that buffer, it's going to eval that buffer. It's going to kill the compile-log buffer that has warnings. We saw those when I compiled it by hand. But when we had the warnings, it split the view into two windows. And so delete other windows gets rid of that extra split. So we're back to having just one window. Emacs uses window to mean a completely different thing that it means in modern, more modern operating systems. And then because I wanted this to be sort of the only thing I wanted was the clock, I turn off some of the decorations. So we turn off the vertical scroll bar, the horizontal scroll bar, toolbar mode, and menu bar mode. That gets rid of many of the decorations. I have an optional argument to the clock function, which says if we want a big one, and if so, we set the frame name, we set the size and position so that it basically vertically fills the screen and then is sort of centered in the horizontal direction. And then these two lines I originally didn't have, and I'll explain why I added them in just a bit. But the main point was I wanted to wait until the second turned over. So in this loop, I say we've got a previous second and we're setting equal to the first element of the decode time of the current time. Now, decode time returns a list. The first element is the seconds, then it's minutes, hours, days, month, year, blah, blah, blah. Um, but I only need the second. And so that gets the initial second. And then while subsequent invocations of the exact same thing return a value that's equal to the previous second, we'll keep looping. And then the instant that such, and this is a spin loop, we just keep doing this until the condition isn't met. And so we do the finally clause at the instant that the second value has flipped. So this should mean that we draw the analog clock right at the boundary of a new second, and the tick mark should work. And this actually mostly worked um, because most of the time I'd already done the SVG analog clock once. But if I invoked, and I'll explain how I invoked it in a bit, and invoked it first time on boot, it sometimes didn't work very well. And the reason is that the whole SVG analog clock drawing, you know, needs to invoke, the whole SVG mechanism, which probably means loading libraries or, doing other things behind the scenes, which have a certain amount of overhead. And so that overhead got in the way. And so even though I thought I was, making the timer that updates the second hand start right at the boundary, that overhead pushed us past the boundary. So my solution is these lines up here, which is to actually draw the clock once. And SVG analog clock has a major mode, and then it binds Q, which is the keystroke that exits it, to this analog clock kill buffer function that's in it. And so I draw the clock and then I kill it uh, before doing my alignment. And so that gets the overhead up there. And then I promised I would show you how I invoke it easily, and that's because I wrote a bat file. Now, I'm on Windows 11, so I have a bat file. This basically invokes run Emacs. On Windows, Emacs.exe will leave behind a console window because you cannot have one executable. You have to, on Windows, you have to say this is a console executable or this is a GUI executable, And if you use Emacs, it's the console one. And if you say Emacs-NW, you get an Emacs that fits into that console. If you say Emacs in a console but don't say NW, then in fact it will spawn a GUI Emacs, but it leaves that console window around. So there's this extra executable called run Emacs that gets rid of that extra console. Um, the equivalent of this in other operating systems would just be Emacs. Um, Anyway, the dash Q says don't do any initialization stuff. The dash load says I want to load this file into the Emacs. That's load as in run, not load as in put into a buffer. And then we're going to execute the clock dash T. So let's see how that works. So there I have my wall clock visible across the room from my monitor. Nicely, the seconds are nicely aligned to the tick marks. There is still some teeny amount of variability. So sometimes, like you can see on those thicker tick marks, it's slightly not in the middle. If I do this, MEDX clock, it may be a little bit better. Maybe a little bit better. Um, Anyway, but this is good enough for my purposes. Thanks for your attention.